Hello, delightful people of the internet. Adventurers who have come to hear our wise wisdom, I guess. Not articulate necessarily, but hey, it'll work. We're talking today on the D&D stream, or sorry, in the Zulu stream, because we're not D&D, we are Zulus. We're talking
Is it
about
for-
homebrew rules in
Yeah.
D&D. That's what I meant to say.
Or the
I
D&D
am
team at Zulus.
It's true, a whole team of us. I am Rob. A quick introduction for those of you who are new, not that we have a lot of them, but hey, it's always good to remind people who we are. I am Rob. I've been playing D&D for about 20 years now. I've been running games for about 15-ish. I've been doing this sort of professional D&D stuff with kids for a little over a year. Alex, tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm Alex. I've been playing D&D for probably, how old am I? On and off, like 10-ish years, but definitely within the last 5. Yeah, definitely within the last 4. I've been like, heck yeah, D&D, heck yeah, D&D. And I've been running games. I've always been a player, but now I've been running games since the pandemic started. So I'm basically just an online D&D guy.
Yeah, basically thrown into the forge just as inundated. Went from no running games or a couple here and there to running 1 or 2 games a day, 5 days a week, and now you're up to 7 days a week.
Yes, now I'm up to 7 days a week, and then sometimes 4 of those are twice a day or 2 sessions a day.
Yeah. So Jason, tell us about yourself.
Oh, so I've been GMing for since I was about 10. So that's, like I said, that's going on 34 years. DMing, game mastering / playing. I've gone through times where I didn't play as much. Of course, like in college, it shot up like crazy. I've played long-term campaigns many a time. So my longest running campaign was 10 years. I've always enjoyed running games. So, yeah. And I've been doing a lot lately since doing the online, but I still did it before then. So
I always forget that you started sort of DMing. Because I very much did the more sort of classic style thing, which I think a lot of people do, which is you begin being a player for a couple years, and then eventually over time you get confident in the rules enough that you're like, hey, I'm going to dive in, start running the games. So that I always find that very fascinating, kind of to see that other perspective.
Yeah, it was just that time period. If you didn't run it, there was nobody. I didn't know anybody who was doing it, or the people that did. The groups were already full. There was a couple like that, and they're older. So to play, and I liked playing oddball games too. So like I played D&D like one shots, trying to running them out of the back of the book, little adventure in the back of the instructions.
Yeah,
and then I started playing Marvel superheroes the most.
Okay.
That was like the one I really played a lot. Yeah. So, puppy.
He does have a very sort of hellhound look from right there.
From that,
It's very, very lean and very dark coat. I like it.
Dude, she is one lean machine. Yes, so as you guys have noticed, I have a special guest, my dog, Xylee. She loves staring out my window. So, yeah, you'll be seeing probably some dog butt or some sleeping dog.
Here.
Oh, what?
Haunches.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Sorry. Please excuse the language.
So for today's topic, I thought it would be a lot of fun. Since we've been DMing for some of us more time, some of us less, I thought it'd be very interesting to dive into sort of homebrew rules. And I was going to grab my DMG, and then I completely forgot it. But that's okay. So for those of you who don't know, homebrew is actually, and I did a blog on this, and I'll hopefully be publishing it later today. But there are actually, I think I've discovered 3 different definitions for homebrew, because it's one of those ones we get kind of tossed around a lot, and I feel like sometimes it can get kind of lost. So I feel like we should begin by defining our terms. In the blog, I talk about the sort of 3 ways that I've heard homebrew used. Firstly is to talk about a homebrew world, which is to say a setting that is completely created by the DM and or players. The second homebrew I've heard is a homebrew campaign, which is to say that it could be set in a pre-existing published setting, but the story itself and the plot and the information has been created by the dungeon master and or players. And then finally, the third thing is homebrew rules. So that's more what we're going to be talking about today. That includes any time that the game master or players modify the rules changes them so they're not as they're written in the book, to either make it more fun, to make it fit the theme better, because there isn't a rule for it. There's a lot of different reasons why you would homebrew a rule. And so what we're discussing today is the rules that we've created over time to make our DMing experience better, and more sort of robust. Jason, because you are the most organized, and I'm not going to say oldest, but you've been doing this for the longest, you actually have a printed sheet of your homebrew rules.
Yeah, this is what I use for this. This has a bunch. I mean, inside is also more home rules. It's my expanded feat list that I use for. So I run for children during the week, and I don't use the homebrew rules for that because it just adds a layer of complication that they don't need. Although it makes me really realize why I do my homebrew rules, because like the first one that I do that is the most the thing I like the most is one I found online at some point. But in D&D, I don't like critical hits that much. They kind of end up, you can roll a critical hit with a weapon and then roll 2 1s. And you're like, so you build up as a DM, you're like, you get that hit, you hit them right in the eye. And then it like nicks their cornea. It does 2 hit points of damage. And they're just like, oh. Yeah. But in this optional rule, it's when you score a critical hit, roll for damage normally, then determine the maximum damage you can roll with your attack before applying any modifiers. Then you can combine that as your critical hit roll. So you add that damage to it. So let's say you do 1d6 with a short sword, and you have +3 for your bonus. You get a critical hit. You'll, instead of rolling 2d6, you roll the 1d6 and add 6, which is the highest you could roll on that dice.
Okay.
So you always do a good hit with a critical hit, and sometimes you'll do a crazy amount. But I kind of, it's the players love it at first until you rolled against them once. But it's but it's still a good one, I think, because it happens so often when you roll that critical hit and it just comes out to a nothing burger, and you're like, oh no, I really wanted that to be good, for the player and for the story. It's like that great moment of rolling that 20 and something doesn't happen. You're like, oh. Yeah.
So that you actually bring up a really good point. And we'll I figure we'll discuss this more as we go along. But one of the things I find very fascinating is the difference of if there's a homebrew rule that affects players, does it also affect the enemies that they fight against? The one that I thought was a great example of that is flanking. So coming from 3rd edition and 3.5 and Pathfinder, flanking is a huge mechanic that is used a lot, and positioning in combat is very important. However, because of 5th edition having significantly less bonuses that go into D20 rolls, generally you're looking at advantage or disadvantage unless it's cover. And that's a huge thing. So being able to simply position yourself and then gain advantage, like I think the idea behind the mechanics is you use your action to give someone else advantage. Regardless, I brought that up when I was first beginning to play with the group. I was like, hey, do you want this as a thing that you can do? With the caveat of your enemies can do it as well. Which they ultimately decided that they didn't want to do that because they're like, we don't want people flanking us and then getting that bonus. And so you brought up a really interesting point in that idea of like, this is super cool for the players. They're like, yeah, our critical hits are going to do something. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh no, our enemy's critical hits are going to do something.
Yeah. They usually do anyways, because if it's a big creature, it's going to tend to roll a lot of dice. So sheer numbers, but the difference between sheer numbers and maxed out dice, is a whole other beast. So, of course, the other problem is it's a thing endemic in D&D, and I haven't messed with this as a house rule, but for things with saves, they never get a critical hit. So a breath weapon, lots of spells. Yeah, so technically they don't. I mean, you could house rule it. I've never done it to see how it would play out, but if they roll a 1, having it be a critical hit, you could.
I think for that one, what it ultimately becomes is you have. Well, yes, you can't have that maximum. Your max is much lower, but also your minimum is much higher because, like, if you're doing an attack and you miss, you do no damage. Whereas
Yeah.
if you do your breath weapon and they succeed, they still take half damage unless they have evasion, but that's, circumstantial anyway. So I think the kind of the trade-off for anything that uses a save is that, sure, your damage ceiling is much lower, but your floor is also much higher.
I guess in my head, I was just thinking of cantrips, and cantrips have the do or don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Sacred Flame and stuff like that.
Yeah, so. I think cantrips, though, run into that issue of because there's no limit to the number of times you can cast them in a given day, they run into that problem of you're basically always doing even a small amount of damage. So, like, if you can get yourself sort of hidden away, you can just start pelt at things, then eventually inevitably kill things. That, of course, runs into the whole problem of balancing on that things. And again, going back to house rules, I could see it being a very sort of... I could definitely see if your group is like, I hate the fact that my Sacred Flame consistently is doing nothing. Like, I'm just, you can just say, well, we're going to treat cantrips like we treat most spells in that if they fail, half damage.
Or giving them some way of getting imposing disadvantage by circumstances or something. Yeah.
Well, that's what Bane's for. Although Bane is a first level spell, but one well-placed Bane then followed with a bunch of saves that people need to take. Pretty good. What else do we have on your list?
So you brought up flanking, and I actually have a rule for flanking that I do use. It doesn't come into play all that often, but when a creature, basically it's if you're on the opposite sides thing, I basically give them each, it then gets a +2 bonus on melee attack rolls.
Yeah.
It lessens it, so it's not as extreme as advantage.
Yeah, which I think that was the third 3.5 edition rules for flanking was a +2.
Yeah, that's basically what it is. And it works well for like a lot of small things, which, don't have a chance of hitting. So like having those kobolds have a chance by swarming is kind of...
But kobolds, though, have pack tactics, which means that if there are two of them, and that actually I think is really powerful. It makes it so kobolds, when they're fighting even in the sunlight, are just like, we fight like normal. Well, I mean, they still have trash bonuses, but at that point, presumably you're low level anyway, so the ACs you're trying to hit is lower as well.
But then it just makes a group of orcs just that much more threatening because they won't have pack tactics, but then if they are flanking and like being smart, oh gosh, totally done for.
Yeah.
Let's see. One of the other ones that I had there's a very strange one that I do that's inspired from another role-playing game, and Alex has seen me do it, which is I have a rule where if a player, it's only the players, they roll 2 20s in a row, something on their character becomes slightly magical. So it kind of, and if they roll 2 ones in a row, something becomes negatively magical. And like I just had that happen in a group. Actually happened, I say just, but it was like 2 months ago, and they still played. But it was her backpack. They even asked like, what got cursed? And I was like, oh, I'll change it later. And they slowly added. They're like, I don't remember where I got this magical backpack because I changed it in her inventory, and I made it so that it kept tossing things out of her backpack. So she was slowly losing items over time. And they'd only just figured it out like 2 months later going, hey, wait a second, I had a tinderbox. I can't light my torches. And it's like, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the cursed, and it's like just minor little tweaks. I think I gave one character boots that let her jump like 1.5 times higher because she made a good athletics roll, and then that was the second 20. And so it was like, all right, that'd be fun. It's not anything super powerful, but it's always interesting to have a magic item and then naming it after the character. So all of a sudden she had the boots of Mora, or that kind of thing. Because in D&D Beyond, it's way easier to change that stuff. And so, yeah.
I like to run that rule too, just because it makes the players feel like that much more epic. And so Red, who's a Warforged, he recently swung his sword and he rolled 2 20s, and so then now he's got Red's long sword.
Yeah,
why not? It makes it more fun.
Yeah, just and usually with the weapons, I just throw like if it's a non-magical weapon, you just put a +1 on it.
Yeah. It's a nice good bonus for it.
It's just that's just a for fun thing that I do. I don't really do that one in the adult game. It's just like it's a fun one for the kids.
Yeah, well, that is actually one of the things that's very interesting. I think we were talking about it before we got started today. Is the difference between homebrew rules that you use for kids versus homebrew rules you use for adults? Because like what things they'll be interested in and how the mechanics work. especially with the groups that I play with. A lot of times, the ones that are are a little bit younger, we're talking like 7 or 8 kind of range. They're definitely not reading the books,
Yeah.
and their sort of grasp on the rules is tentative. But that's not the point. The point is that they're going on these epic adventures and having fun. And in cases like that, I too have less of a tight grip on the rules, just because I'm thinking of it. One of the ones that a lot of times I'll do is if the players have a particularly interesting reason for why they've done something. The one that's the most commonly used is like a minor illusion or a silent image to like make themselves look more terrifying or awesome or whatever. And then from that, they'll gain advantage on their either intimidates or persuasions. And that's one that's pretty easy to do. Where I like to reward the creativity of them being like, I've used this illusion to do thus and such. I'm like, awesome. Then that's an advantage for you.
Man, you just totally stole my thing. I was totally gonna say
sorry.
that. No, you're all good.
Why
Don't
don't you
worry
tell us
about it.
better?
No, it's all good. I like to steal a lot of homebrew ideas from both you guys, just
Yeah.
because I'm like, roll another 20. Oh, your source magic. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my things too is I'll improv. I mean, it's an improvisational role thing, but like sometimes when situations come out, you're like, suddenly I want to make this very exciting. So like in one instance, they were doing a kind of a stealth mission, and it was a lightning storm out, and so I had them. At the end of every one of their turns, they had to roll a d20. If they rolled a 1, it was a super electrical storm. They would get hit. If they're wearing metal armor, on 1 or a 2, they would get hit by lightning. Okay. And if they were undercover, then they had. It was like I forgot. I had a system. I don't remember what it was, but flashback rules. Interesting. I'll jump that in a second.
Yeah, I just thought it myself.
Yeah, So like doing something like that, it was like for a whole encounter, it made that counter much more tense as they're trying to sneak around. And then I had, more complications as guards like were yelling at them from windows and things like that to try and draw them out into the lightning. As a DM, that's what I was doing, but the guards weren't trying to do that. But yeah, that kind of thing is fun. You want to take on the
Smoke Puncher here brought up the idea of flashback rules, and I think I remember the one because I've talked to him about it before. I think essentially the idea behind the flashback rule is as you're going through an encounter, you realize, it would be a really good idea to have done this or whatever. I think of it a lot of times kind of like how they do heist movies or heist things, where they're going through the heist and they're like, and then we'll get the key card that we got from this, and then they'll smash cut, go to the scene where they got the key card from the guard because of yada yada whatever. Because it's one of those things where like time is not necessarily linear in D&D. So I think, and you'll have to remind me, Smoke Puncher, what do you use rolls for yours, or is it just like if you think of it and it makes sense for the story, do you use it? So we'll let him respond to that in chat.
I do it a little bit with the kids because sometimes they'll be like, my character has a this, and I'll be like, well, how'd you get that? And they'll say, well, my dad gave it to me. If they don't, a lot of times I've done it with kids, they will abuse it. And I will call for a roll. Just be like, all right, if you roll this, then that'll happen. Because there's a couple of kids that I play with that I did that with, and I regretted it. Because it was quickly turned into, and my best friend is the captain of the guard, and you're like, no.
You're like, hold on one second. I've kind of run into that experience where there's a kid who's like, no, I have a friend. And I'm like, okay, so yeah, sure, you do have a Dragonborn friend because you're also a Dragonborn. Makes sense. And then he's like, don't you remember the war he totally made up of a history of the world that I didn't even explain at all. And I'm just like, okay, sure.
Yeah. See, what I think can be a lot of fun for that, though, is let them go on their sort of like weird, not weird, sorry, that's a terrible way to say it. They're delightfully creative tangents about this war that happened back in the day and this sort of thing.
The war for magic.
Yeah. Well, and then have it be like one of those things where, I don't know, maybe he, in that war, wronged someone and they're now hunting him.
Yeah.
So that can be kind of a fun thing to do where you're like, well, you've created this backstory. I'm going to integrate it into the story that I'm doing now. But there are consequences to your actions.
Yeah.
I think that can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, with adults it's a lot easier because they're more willing to take the my idea is slightly corrupted and it's not exactly what I thought it was. Whereas kids will be like, "That's not what I wanted. I wanted, this," and you're like, "Well, it's slightly different now," because I've had that one. I'm like, "No, the pirate ship. Like you remember it when you were a kid. It was super awesome, but it's had bad days, so it needs to be fixed now."
Yeah. I know for one of my adult groups, they were going through the adventure, through what we call season 1, and then afterwards they were like, "Wait, how do we know each other?" And I'm like, "You all have group amnesia, so now we're gonna go and experience flashbacks."
Yeah.
So that's actually one of the things that's always very difficult to do, is especially that sort of like group dynamic of getting groups together. I have just sort of especially because I do I've done a handful of one shots with strangers where basically I'm like, here's a character, we've got 4 hours, we're going to teach you how to play the game as we're playing the game, kind of a thing, which is really fun. It's a great sort of crash course to get the numbers working, to kind of get the thing going. But one of the things I discovered that was very fun for that sort of like how they met each other was I would just throw out scenarios of like you find yourself on stranded on an island when your ship is wrecked by a terrible storm. You discover that the island is inhabited by a group of natives that worship a kraken. How do you want to deal with these people that live on this island? Do you try to present yourself as a better god, different god, representative of their god, sneaky route? Do you want to try and use brute force to convince them to like steal their stuff and get away, or do you want to try to get to know them a little better, learn more about it, and hopefully not get sacrificed?
Or do you explain that you are the avatar of their god?
Exactly. And them having to kind of make that quick decision, and I obviously don't make it roll for all that stuff because this is in their past, but that can be kind of a fun way for them to get to know their character a little better, to do sort of a little bit more, to sort of dive into it. That's a very sort of specific use case, but in a kind of similar vein, I had a GM for a different game who every game would start in blue. Complete blue, and then you would see something in this blueness and you would move towards it, generally sometimes, and then you'd be presented with a pair of images and you had to choose between those two images, and over the course of these sort of images you would essentially discover who your character was, mostly because within the context of the game your character is essentially being born from a well, as this sort of blank slate. So it was really interesting to basically, like, as you're making these decisions, sort of locking in, so how does this character think? Again, a very strange use case scenario, but kind of a fun thing you can do, and kind of continuing on that flashback idea of using the flashbacks to help people get to know their characters. As far as, and this was mentioned a little bit by our delightful commenter, part of what they were talking about with the flashbacks in particular is making it so that the planning stage, because I don't know if you guys, but and especially with adults, you can really get mired in that whole, like, oh, we have to plan for all sort of contingencies, and instead of, like, just hopping in and, like, because it's all speculation at that point. You're planning for things you can't possibly know. So if you sort of just dive in and then say, well, flashback anything we didn't think of, then that can be a thing. Kitty! One of the other things, on a similar note, I had another GM that I loved how he did this. You would craft, you're like, I'm going to craft potions or poisons or whatever. And you would say that you're doing that, but it wasn't until you pulled the potion out, or poison or whatever, and tried to use it, that he would then have you roll for how well you made the potion. Because you had no way of knowing, like, oh, I made a bad batch. Because a lot of times it's hard to not metagame that whole thing of, like, well, it's a bad batch, it's sort of rubbish. Let me roll again, kind of thing. So that was always very fun. Plus, when you're pulling out your potion or your poison, having that dice roll of, instead of just being like, I'm going to quaff a potion and gain some health back. It's like, no. How well did you make that potion several weeks back?
That's it. Yeah, I mean, and that whole thing of, like, because, like, for me, it's a kind of an unofficial house rule. I tend to do, at least in adult games, not with kids, as I always do a session 0, like, well in advance of getting ready to run the game, so I can kind of weave, like, what did all these characters make, and how can I make that cohesive? Like, so in the first, I run the game for a game on Sundays for a lot of the Zulu's employees, and the first time we did it, everybody had no family. and no connections to the world. They just all weirdly ended up in like, I was just born yesterday, and I just got out of prison, and things like that kind of thing. And so I was like, well, they're people that have no ties. They're like the perfect Suicide Squad. So, like, these are people that will not be missed. So I'm like, they're going to be put on a mission, and they won't, and nobody cares what happens to them. So they're like a last ditch. Maybe they'll succeed. Maybe they won't.
Yeah.
Make them seem like heroes and realize, oh no, we're just those people. That was my thing. But it was from looking at those characters. Yeah. Looking at those characters and seeing what was the commonality, but I had the breathing room between making the characters and starting the game. Because if I wouldn't have had that, I would have just been, all right, I guess, you show up here, Yeah. But I've also done weird things in terms of doing the flashbacky thing. Whereas like in that same game, I knew I was going to, from the beginning, I wanted to do a time travel game, which is one of the more complicated things. I was like, I want to do something fun. So I set up this whole encounter where it's like post-apocalyptic island where everything had been destroyed. But I knew I had to hit certain points because I wanted to do a time travel where they go back to before the island was destroyed. So they're going to see everything in a different light the next time through. They're completely different, but I had to set up certain, this, you see that, you see the other.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to give the clues there would be time travel. So I started doing like one of the sessions, like they were just getting kind of thrown into their own past and able to alter things in their past. So it kind of did a session 0 in the middle of the game where like they could change aspects of their character through these, like it's a whole setup thing, but that they were doing it in the middle of the game, and it also revealed stuff about their character, like, oh, your father really betrayed your dwarven clan, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And my character had like voices in his head.
Yeah.
Or just am I a bad guy or am I a good guy? I don't really know at this point.
Yeah.
It's always the ambiguity of a
that was another house rule I did, because I have a lot of specific strange backgrounds you can take that aren't normal. It's like one of the ones Alex took was that he had amnesia. So he didn't even know what his proficiencies were until he tried to do them. He had no idea. So I had to plot out what he was before and then pick the skills for him. And it would also reveal stuff about him.
I did an experiment very similar to that once that was magical. Have you played White Wolf before?
Yes.
So in post Gehenna, they have, in their second edition, I guess, they have their just World of Darkness like mortal book where you're a normal dude. You've got your 9 stats and your however many skills. And I use that as my base because it's really good sort of free-form, sort of normal human thing. And I had a bunch of them wake up in these tubes in a place. And I had all their character sheets pre-made in front of me, and then I gave them all blank character sheets. And I was like, all right, let's do this. And so use skills, and as they tried different things, I would tell them how many dice that they would roll. And in that game, however many dots you have in an attribute and a skill, you roll that many 10-sided dice. So they then were able to deduce over time how many dice they had, like what their stats were in their thing. It was a very fun sort of way of them sort of revealing to themselves like what character they are. That one ultimately didn't end up going for more than a single session, which made me kind of sad because I really enjoyed the whole sort of them slowly discovering their characters.
Finding yourself.
Huh?
Finding yourself, discovering yourself.
They find themselves. So the session 0, I think, is a really big thing to mention. For all the DMs out there, have a session 0. Always have a session 0. Knowing the expectations of your players and your own expectations going into it is very important. I had a game once where I wanted to play sort of a dark, gritty, going back to World of Darkness, Changeling the Lost game, where it was this sort of this world where everything is very dark and gritty, and you're trying to come to grips with a world you don't quite understand that's sort of alien because you were pulled out of it and damaged by the Fae and then thrown back into it. And my players wanted to be a bunch of firemen with a fire truck with a panda for an engine. And it was lighthearted and fun, and they were going to be goofy and wacky and all that good stuff. And our very different sort of starting place caused the game to essentially implode on itself very quickly because like my tone and their response to the things Very different. But also, this is very important. In your session 0 is when you can discuss homebrew rules and which ones you want to use, which ones you like, which one you don't, how they'll affect the game ultimately. So have a session 0, discuss your homebrew rules is the moral of that particular story. Jason, do you have more homebrew rules for us?
Yeah, I was looking at it. This is a weird one, but I like it. So on initiative, if you roll critical success or critical failure, if you have advantage for the first turn, if you rolled a critical success on whatever you do, and if you have a critical failure, you have disadvantage on whatever you do. He's kind of like you just screwed up on initiative. So, yeah. But that's just a quick one. It's kind of just fun. Yeah. So I like that one, just because it's always nice. I like whenever you roll 20 for it to be kind of exciting. I don't like it to, I like having a 20 be a little bit better when you roll like persuasion or something. I'll be like, yeah, that was better. But we've had several players, kids especially, will be like, well, I get to change reality when I roll.
I literally had a kid shout out, I rolled a 20, that changes all of reality. And I'm like, no, you were just trying to jump onto a boat. You're just like trying to swim. You're not changing all of reality itself.
Yeah.
Now that's a different roll.
That's magic. That's what magic is for.
Right? That's the Arcana check.
Yeah.
I
mean, I like to give a little bit of extra information. Like they roll. It's the same information. Sometimes it's the same information. I just make it sound like you notice that there's a crack in the armor or something. Just like that he obviously bought his armor, off the rack or something stupid. But it's at least something. But I don't like it to be game changing with the other rolls. It's funny because I do like the critical hits to be more of a hit, but you kind of have to be careful with giving. Like I said, persuasion doesn't make everything on your pet. That's one of the kids really think that. I rolled a 20 to do animal handling. Now it's my best friend forever and ever and ever, and I will forget about it by next session.
Yeah. And that is always kind of the interesting thing is trying to sort of reconcile the difference in sort of time. Well, the thing that I actually discovered is I started watching Avatar, the Last Airbender, and in one of the episodes near the end of the show, there is one where the one non-bender. Who's the non-bender? Sokka decides that he wants to learn a new skill because he's not a bender. So he decides he's going to go learn how to sword fight. And then they show this whole montage of him getting better at sword fighting. And at the end, the guy's like, that was a good first day. And I was like, no. No. Like, I've like, that's not how quickly you learn skills. But I realized that I think that's a relatively common thing in a lot of shows, especially kids shows, where they're like, I want to do this new thing, and it's immediate. I think that might also, and so I think a lot of times it is that same way where someone's just like, I want to make a magical item or train an animal or whatever. And it's like, that takes so much time. Like, that is a time-consuming thing. And even, like, explaining the mechanics of, like, creating items. Like, it's 25 gold per day. You have to spend 8 hours a day. So if you have, something that costs an amount of money that I'm blanking on. So let's say only 250 gold. That's going to be 10 days of work. Like that.
Yeah. Well, even, like, simple things like casting a ritual, which will take you 10 minutes. Yeah. That one, it's like, you can't do that in combat. I mean, you can try, but 10 minutes in combat is an extraordinary amount of time. Yeah. And, it's like, and you can break it down, it's like every round is 10 seconds, you got,
so, even a minute takes forever.
10 rounds to make a minute.
Yeah. So you gotta, you got a wait ahead of you, and you're not doing anything else. And you might, that first round is okay, but they're like, okay, is it cast yet? Because I so many times.
It's only been 6 seconds, kid. I have a kid who found, what is the spell? It's a spell, it's not mending, but it's something else where it works kind of like mending, where you take stuff and then it takes 10 minutes to cast, and every single time there's like a chunk of metal. He's like, can I cast the spell? I'm blanking out on the spell. It starts with like an R or something.
Restore? No, that's not.
No, it's not quite restore.
What does the
It's
spell do?
basically it like takes material pieces and then combines them together into something else. I am forgetting what spell.
That's not sounding familiar to me at all. But
Yeah, no,
Right.
you're.
That's not alter self.
I
Yeah.
am now metal.
I am now metal.
We'll let you gander that for a second anymore. Jason, do you have any more house rules for us?
Oh yeah. Let's see. Let me pull out the handy paper. All right. So another one that I do is healing potions. I make them better. Basically, I make it take a whole action to drink a potion, but instead of rolling for the amount of healing you get the maximum amount.
Oh.
It's a simple thing. So you just it kind of that way you don't waste your bonus action and roll because a low roll with a healing potion is like, why did I even bother?
Yeah.
Especially at high levels.
No.
There's no point. And so it's just a little thing. But I also have potions take an action to drink. Like you're chugging down a bottle. Unless you're something weird like a drunken master, I might allow a bonus action to drain a bottle.
Right.
Or if it fits the character. Because I'm pretty free with that stuff. But it's just like that was just one of those things that I didn't like. But yeah.
By the way, I found the spell that I was complaining about. It's Fabricate, so the casting time takes 10 minutes. Sure, the duration is instantaneous, but anytime that there's like some raw, like there's literally a chunk of metal, it's a pile of rocks, he's always trying to cast it, and I'm like, do you seriously want to spend all of combat casting Fabricate to turn a piece of metal into a robot?
That's a really good
so
spell.
much more than just like it's 10 minutes is so much more than all of combat. It's combat and then more time afterwards. It's like, combat
you're
and
starting
then
your rest. Yeah.
I tend to find that the younger the player, the less they can understand the concept of in-game time versus real-life time. Because that same group is filled with younger kids. And I was like, well, this journey is going to take you about 2 days. And they're like, 2 in real life days? And I'm like, no, 2 game days.
Yeah.
Like, I can literally snap my fingers and say a week has gone by. And they're just having a challenging time understanding.
Yeah. You have to rest for 4 to 8 hours. Well, we won't be playing in 8 hours. Yeah, that's
real quick. I just have to, because you brought that up, and I saw this recently. I was rewatching some animated spellbook stuff, which also, if you haven't watched animated spellbook, his stuff is amazing. But he talked about the difference between a long rest and a short rest, and then he mentioned the, I think, gritty realism version, and this is madness. So normally, short rest, hour, long rest, 8 hours. In this version, a short rest is 8 hours, and a long rest is a week. And it's one of those things where all of a sudden that short rest becomes like, well, and then you've also got the problem of you're running low on on hit die to be able to regenerate hit points with.
Right.
And I was just like, I heard about that, and I was just like, oh my gosh. Part of me was very excited to play in a game with that. Another part of me was just like, that sounds so brutal. But I think what it really helps is I feel like a lot of the homebrew rules you can use, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I think they really help to set the stage and feel of the game that you're playing. The homebrew rule that I use a lot that I don't even think about now anymore is I don't like counting arrows. Because to me, a hero that is an archer, part of them being an archer is knowing how to make more arrows. You can find sticks, feathers, and flint out in the world. If you kill someone, you can then get the stuff. If nothing else, if you break an arrow by shooting at them, you at least go retrieve your arrowheads and maybe even the fletching to be able to make new arrows. Yeah. However, in the case that there's a game where they're underground and resources are limited, I would find that very fascinating, like a challenge for them to be able to, like, how many arrows do you have? Are you going to run out of arrows? But even then, largely what I'd probably do is present them with the challenge of, what are you doing for arrows? They then say, well, I'm going to use this as my solution. And I'm like, perfect. You've come up with your solution for your arrows. You don't have to worry about it anymore. But that's mostly because I like to think of players as heroes, and worrying about how many arrows you happen to have is not a heroic thing to do. In the same way that like a lot of times I don't worry about encumbrance because I'm just like, you're a hero, you're big and strong. You'll find a place to put it eventually anyway.
Yeah, there's also the fun. Maybe a critical failure might be you're running low on arrows. You've only got this many left. Because that could be a brutal, like yeah, you missed with that shot, but you're also you're because setting up that dramatic encounter where you've only got 5 arrows left, you're going to have to use them sparingly.
Yeah, well, and I think that comes back to the idea of like realism versus living in a fantasy world. Of like in an action movie, they don't reload with their guns. They'll 100 bullets before they reload, but then maybe they fire twice and they need to reload again because it's dramatically important. And I think that's kind of how I play my games, is much more done like a movie or a show, in that I try to make sure that the rules sort of make it feel sort of interesting. And I think that comes back to what you were talking about, Jason, with like the criticals. Like you want them to feel more powerful. You want the healing potions to feel better. The homebrew rules working to sort of help further the feel that you want for the story is very much a thing.
There's another one that I think Alex uses this as well, that we use with the kids, which is rounding up versus rounding down.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I round up for the heroes, or round down in case of damage, like when they take damage and have resistance or something, and I round up for the villains. Or the monsters. So yeah, it's like it's 1 point on either side. Yeah, so it's like it's always in favor of the players. Whatever's better for the players is typically where I go.
Typically, the wording I use is I'll round up for you guys and round down against you guys.
Yeah.
I like it. That's a lot of fun, and it's a small thing. And I think ultimately, what a lot of these come down to is that. And I think it says it like in the first couple pages of the DMG and the player's handbook is the rules are much more of a guideline than necessarily like set in stone. So changing them to make them feel sort of appropriate. Now that being said, changing your rules fluidly in the middle of the thing because it sort of feels like the thing you want to do, I think is a quick way to piss off your players. But making sure that the rules sort of fit the feel and style of your game, I think, can be very, very beneficial. Now, Alex, we haven't dove into a lot of your rules. Jason has his very convenient things, but I feel like let's go ahead and hear some of your house rules.
Well, typically a lot of my house rules will be a copy of Jason's house rules, or I'll just be like copying somebody else, or like how you mentioned, if they're creative in like their setup for, I'm going to shoot some ice or shoot some water into this lock, freeze it, and then expand the ice or whatever. And I'm like, sure, you can do a sleight of hand check with advantage. Or they're like, I'm going to like throw something around so then I can. Or they're like, if they put in the work, I'll be like, yeah, you get advantage. And typically with there's the mechanic for 5e where there's inspiration. I don't really give out a lot of inspiration because partially I forget, but also they do so many other things. And I know the rules are like saying, oh, hey, if you do something and the DM likes it, they'll give you inspiration. But I find that a lot of times players forget they have inspiration. So I'll just change it and just be like, you know what? For this, you've got inspiration. I liked your speech. You have advantage on persuasion.
So it's like timed inspiration where you have inspiration, but for this roll.
Exactly, because then otherwise they will forget. And I've had kids who are like, oh, I've had inspiration for 3 months, and I'm like, then why haven't you used it?
Or you'll go to give them inspiration, they'll be like, oh no, I already have inspiration. I'm like, oh
yes, oh my gosh.
So actually, you reminded me. So going back to White Wolf, I got a lot of very interesting things from White Wolf. One of the things that they had in Exalted was a thing called Stunt Dice. I love Stunt Dice. So essentially, what it is if you describe what you're doing more interestingly, you add dice to your pool. And again, it's a dice pool system, so you have your skill and your attribute, and you roll that many dice. And then if you describe it awesome, you get to add another dice to it. And I would also add a mechanic where it added to essentially your mana that you had access to. But I've always loved that kind of idea where, in combat, as a fighter, you can be like, I swing my sword at him, roll my d20, wow, you did some damage. Or you can be dropping my left shoulder low, I bait there, and then pivot to twist, catching the arm. And I'm like, that's awesome, that's fun. I mean, combat's a little harder because the mechanics are a little bit more sort of Ein Zwei. But but yeah, it's essentially sort of the D&D equivalent of a stunt dice is to reward that sort of creativity, and I think that makes it just overall a much more rewarding game for everyone. So what else do you got for us, Alex?
I mean, I mostly just copy a lot of Jason's rules, where if they roll 2 20s, their weapon becomes magical, or if they are creative, like how you mentioned, then they get the temporary inspiration. And then there's like some points where the kids will just like, oh, how would I describe it? There's a lot of times like I'll try and go easier on the kids. I always like try and play so then, like how you mentioned, the players are the heroes. They are, I'd typically say superheroes, but that's probably copyright issue. But anyway, they are the heroes of the adventure. They of course have to be the most epic. So I always try my best to make them sound super cool, and the enemies just sound super lame. And it's just like, well, he's trying to swing his sword at you, but you're able to catch his blade with your blade. And then let them be able to describe and get as close as I can. When they say I'm going to chop their arm off and they roll like a 19, and I'm like, oh, that's really high. You slice towards his arm, and it's a really big gash.
Yeah, that's always one that I find very fascinating, is the whole, like, I want to try and shoot him in the eye. And I think that's always, like, you're always, when you're attacking, going to try and attack the vulnerable spots. But the person is just going to stand there and take it. And I think that comes back to the idea, by the nature of how D&D combat is sort of, like, how it plays out in real time, there's that sort of, like, give and take where, like, one person swings, then stands there, gets hit, and then they swing, and then they stand there and get hit. And I think that's also sort of replicated in many ways in a lot of, like, video game RPGs that are turn-based. Your Divinities, your Icewind Dales, your that sort of thing, where it's very much like
fantasy.
You give a whack and then you wait, and you give a whack and then you wait. But like that's of course just the abstraction of a much more complicated sort of give and take of combat. In the same way that, like, you know, you don't magically at level 5 get to the point where I can swing twice now. I don't know. Like, it's you've gotten to the point where you've swung your sword enough that you're like, oh, if I hit here, then I can twist into another shot, kind of a thing. But the whole sort of idea of having, like, trying to explain that combat is an abstraction is even difficult, I think, sometimes for adults to sort of wrap their noodles around, because it is kind of an odd concept. Sorry, someone is attempting to call me.
Oh. Yeah. So yeah, I'll bring up another house rule-y thing that I've been doing recently. Like, I recently did a kind of a weird challenge to myself. I was like, I want to do something weird in this group, and I looked over at my game shelf and saw Mice and Mystics, and I was like, that'd be kind of funny to turn the players into mice and run an adventure with them as mice. And as I was thinking about how I was going to do this and make it feel like they were mice, I did a simple thing, which is now, instead of rolling, while they're mice, they don't roll d20s for attack, they roll d10s. And a critical hit isn't a 10 because it's way easier to get a 10. So they have to roll they roll a second time, and if they roll a 10 they get to add that roll when they roll a 10.
Yeah.
But all the difficulties are halved. So all the armor classes and stuff are half. So it just feels smaller because you're rolling the d10, and all the damage dice steps are down too. So like if it's a d8, it becomes a d4. Yeah. So that kind of thing. So their spells are all affected. Like, they still have spells and stuff because they're not quite mice. They're like mice people, but mice sized. But yeah, it's just a lot of fun. But like that's a weird, like, that was just an improv-y house rule. I was like, how do I make it feel like, because if they're just still rolling 20s and just taking massive penalties, it kind of, that just
well, penalties are always one of those things. Like, it's the difference between like a penalty versus a bonus to an enemy kind of thing, which is very fascinating. Because like you getting a penalty or your enemy getting a bonus are essentially the same thing mechanically, but the feel of them are very different. Which can, I think, really help sort of set the stage. So like having someone that imposes like a minus whatever on attack is going to feel very different for someone who increases their AC by that same amount when they are attacked, which I think can be a lot of fun, kind of playing around with that whole kind of concept.
Well, speaking of like having some weird things going on, I I actually just picked up some weird minis that I saw online because I'm like, oh, these look super dope. So they are, hopefully the camera can work. They
I
are
know what it
banana
is.
people.
Yeah.
Oh my.
So I still need to paint them, but oh my gosh, I'm so excited. So just so then they can be bananas and go crazy.
Who doesn't like to be a banana?
Right, exactly. There was I actually just recently had some people go through this chaos room, and they were looking into the room, and everything seemed normal. And then they looked like bananas. Of course, I didn't really want to change their rolling that much, so I didn't make them roll d10s instead of d20s. But I'm just like, you look like a banana.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, well, I think the difference between like you can have something where you sort of remind people like, oh hey, this is your sort of differences, or like if they roll badly, be like you can just be like, well, you find that your sort of mushy skin has a difficult time of dealing with the athleticism that is required for this particular task. But yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I like actually went in and made in D&D Beyond. I made a transmuted mouse a custom race.
Oh.
And so it affected their stats. So they were no longer like, I'm not a half orc anymore. I'm a transmuted mouse, like
Nice.
barbarian.
Yeah.
And I changed out their little portraits for mice, and
Yeah.
they found that hilarious because like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, I'm very different right now.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Yeah.
Very different.
One of the we're kind of all over the map. That's okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to throw out one of the other things that I enjoy as far as house rules go for initiative is a lot of times, and this was partially done originally because of pure laziness. I'll be frank, but also because I like the idea. So when I do initiative for enemies, they get a 10. So then I add their initiative modifier to it, and their initiative is a 10. And some players have caught on to that, and some of them have not. But what I like about that is it means that going back to that whole 20 is a good thing. Like if the kid's like, oh man, I rolled a 17, that's great. I'm like, cool, I rolled a 20. So sure, you've got a +3, but I've got a +1, so I'm still going first.
Yeah.
And sure, I mean that's kind of the way of it. Like there is that sort of reaction, but I like that kind of static DC because then it becomes less of a roll off and more becomes like sort of a static DC to see like, can you go before people, especially because there's not really that sort of surprise round as much, and also there's the concept of if you want to like in the middle of a conversation, you're like, well then I'm going to draw my sword and stab them, and they won't be ready for it. It's like. Sure, but that person is watching you, and they watch your hand go to your blade, and then I'm just going to stand there and be like, man, this is going to suck. And then so then that becomes that kind of that sort of static DC, and they kind of know like immediately, because that beginning of combat is always sort of mechanically sort of a bit of a slog because you have to get everyone's initiative, you have to make sure the map is set up. There's that kind of slow thing, so they can know very immediately like. I'm going to try and draw my sword and get the drop on him. And I rolled a 5. Now, I didn't move fast enough. Or I got a 17. Yes, I definitely beat this guy on the draw. Because I've definitely had that before where like I've been playing through the thing, they're like, I'm gonna get him. And then before I started doing static numbers, and then I happened to roll just really good. And they rolled mediocrely good. And they're talking about like, okay, so I'm going to do this and they do that. There's a lot of pre-planning that goes in the beginning of combat. And the whole combat starts with me being like, nope, I go first. I don't know. I that makes my life easier in a couple ways. I like the static initiative for enemies. So.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Yeah, I it's always kind of disheartening. I mean, one of the things that is rolling with the online dice roller that we use, where you can see everybody's result. That's the other reason why the 220s works really well, is because you have evidence of rolling the 20s. Because you will forget you're just like, oh no, you made a roll in between that 20 and the other one. Yeah. It's nice to have a thing that I can go to and be like, oh, this is where we rolled, and you did not roll two 20s in a row.
Yeah.
Because that way it becomes more rare. Because like kids will remember, I rolled a 20. Mm-hmm. But having that list of that, it keeps me honest in that like, oh, I rolled it. Because when I'm rolling, I'm like, they know I rolled a 1. There's no fudging that because it's right in the middle of the room.
Yep.
But I swear I'd never roll good on initiative for the main villains. Like this is the end all be all battle.
Yeah.
Ugh. And I just rolled the worst initiative, and they're all gonna beat on them. So okay, hopefully I survive the
Actually,
first round.
that actually reminds me of a homebrew rule that I use sometimes. So sometimes when I roll a 1 to hit for an enemy, because all the players can see the one, I'm like, oh, yeah, he left himself open. Guess what? You get an immediate attack, helping the players feel like they're the heroes, even though they're murdering people. But that way they can actually get in a hit and do a little bit more damage.
It always
And they don't have to
depends.
roll 2 hit.
Yeah, I'll do that sometimes. Sometimes it all depends on like the type of enemy, because sometimes just humiliating the villain is way more
Reward
exciting
enough.
for the players.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if they trip down the stairs when they're doing their epic speech, that is like the moment that they just die for. They're just like, oh yes, we got them in a way that even if they didn't necessarily do it, it's just him falling down the stairs. That's awesome to them, and
So it's funny you mentioned, Alex, about the rolling ones and getting opportunity attacks for it. And again, it keeps coming back to this whole thing where I love presenting rules to players that are beneficial to them, but that the enemies also get. So the one that I did for a long time was if you roll the 1, you rolled again, and if you roll the 5 or less, something bad happens. Most of the time it's an opportunity attack, but it could also be you throw your weapon across the room. And it was definitely one of those ones where, I was like, so this is a thing, and enemies can do it, and so that's the good chance that you'll get to do it, but that means that you also have to live by those same rules, where sometimes you screw up, and that means they get to take advantage of your weakness. So...
Yeah.
And that one though, I ultimately decided not to do because it added an extra level of added complication. But also, what's funny, you mentioned the whole having the dice roll there, and I don't know what it is about when I'm playing against when I'm running monsters is sometimes they just murder things. Like I more often than not will fudge my numbers to make it either not a hit or not a crit because this is back when I could hide my dice rolls because I didn't want to murder the players because it's that sort of challenge of trying to find the balance of combat, and a lot of times the enemies are sort of designed to have a certain level of failure within the things that they're trying to do. But if you have an enemy that just is consistently rolling good, or even then crits. I've had a handful of enemies that are they do 3d6 necrotic damage for whatever reason at level 4 or 5. And that can be brutal. And it's extremely brutal if they crit. Because now it's 6d6 of damage from one of their attacks. And it seems to always be on someone that's already taken a hit and is already kind of weak. So more often than not, I will find myself fudging numbers in the favor of players because I'm like, I don't want to kill all the players. And it seems like it always happens to the person who's already been having a rough go of it. So they're like, I keep getting these hits against me. What do I do? And it's like, I get out of combat
well, that's
or
one of the other
literally
things.
anything else.
Yeah, as you're saying about who it happens to, I've noticed kids don't like to move around the battlefield that much. They'll move towards an enemy, but I'm like, you have 3 hit points. You need to get away. It's an animal.
Losing a whole action to disengage. Why would I use my action to disengage? I need to then attack them and then move away. I'm like, well, that's going to get you hit, and that'll probably take you down.
Yeah. Constantly reminding the rogues they can do that as a bonus action.
Yep.
You can hit, disengage, and get away.
Yeah.
So
I think goblins have that as well. There was a kobold the other day that was trying to get out of combat and forgot that. And it was a very intense sort of combat. They were in a jail cell, and he had to decide if he was going to possibly face. This was with the adult game, so he had to decide if he was going to face his trial for 2 murders that he did not commit that he was being framed for, or run away from the city. And it happened that there was a big distraction. There was only 2 guards. The 2 guards had come in to manacle him to be because the person had tried to kill themselves, and so action economy was very, very important. Which all of that is to say that kobolds do not have the free disengage in the same way that goblins do.
Right.
But yeah. I love with adults, especially with adults, giving them those interesting moral quandaries of what do you do? Also, fun fact: feign death is a cleric spell. So if you have an evil cleric that is trying to frame someone for murder, all they have to do is he's attacking me. Feign death.
Yeah.
And it was really great too because she was rushed off back to her temple where they were going to resurrect her, which was just feign death, just ended after its appropriate amount of time. So yeah, that was going to be very interesting. There was that fun call at the beginning of the game where I'm like, are they going to try to escape, get into combat, or go through with the whole trial thing, which I thought was going to be very interesting to do. Which I think is a good segue. Just to mention this real quick. Next week we're going to be talking about improv and sort of how do you sort of come up with an adventure on the fly? Because I know that a lot of times when like you're listening to people be like, you got to learn how to improv. And it's like, how do you learn to improv? It's like, well, we can help you out with that. So I guess do we have more house rules that we want to talk about?
That's pretty much all of mine. I mean, I have one other one that I do, which is I do a smarter hit points, which is I don't do it with the kids because it's too complicated. It's not too complicated to anyone, but it's hard to explain without dice in front of you. But it's you always roll for your hit points rather than taking the minimum the suggested number. So, but my thing is, if you roll under it, you get the minimum. So, like if you're a wizard, the minimum is like 4.
Yeah.
So you would roll that d6, and if you happen to get higher than that, you would keep it. If you roll under, it resets to a 4. Because man, you roll a 1 and you're a wizard. Whoo!
Life sucks.
Brutal.
Yeah, I did a similar thing for a long time, but you're right, it is a little bit more complicated to sort of explain. Now anymore, I just say, meh, you get that suggested number for hit points, just because the less sort of extra stuff that you have to do, I think, the better. The one that I had a DM use for a while that I used for a bit that was very fun was you would roll for your hit points, and then they would secretly also roll for your hit points. And then you had to decide, are you going to take your roll or their roll? But whichever one you decided, you had to keep that one, and you didn't know what their roll was until after you decided. So that was always interesting, especially like if you have like a D10 and you roll like a 6. You're like, ooh, did they retire? So that was a fun house rule that I had a buddy use and still uses, which I thoroughly enjoy.
Oh, there's another really weird house rule I did in the last. So I have 2 like concurrent campaigns going, and in the second one I did my session 0. And I don't know if you ever heard of the game Fiasco.
No. Tell us about
Fiasco. Yeah, so it's a kind of a weird role-playing game where it's role-playing-esque, where you basically are just kind of doing like a Coen Brothers movie. You kind of create these backstories for the characters, and they all end up with some kind of they have a weird backstory, but they also will intersect with the other players.
Okay.
And so you roll a bunch of dice, and you place dice on like things like with that family, and then you have 2, and we're brothers, or he married my sister, that kind of thing. It's hard to explain without showing a graphic, but in that I made a special one for D&D. So like in that case, like one of the characters wants to sacrifice one of the other characters to their god, that kind of thing. That's what it ended up with, or that they both went to the same drug supplier, and so that's how they met. Adult game, not kids. But yes, that
definitely adult game.
Yeah. So, but that was kind of fun. It was a weird, like, I just wanted to kind of get past the whole, like, it forced the relationships, and so we did kind of the session 0 was this like game of Fiasco of making the characters and what their backgrounds would be.
I think there was I don't know if we ever actually ended up playing. So in my last gaming group back when I lived in Idaho, we loved our session 0 so much that sometimes we would have a month's worth of session 0s. We had one of the campaigns that was a lot of fun. Literally, there was a whole month where at least once a week we would like deep dive into how our characters knew each other, how they had gotten the nightclub, because it was, of course, I think that one was Mage. So we had a nightclub, and like we were like fleshing out. There was a bunch of what were the werewolves that are sort of homeless people?
Bonars.
Bonars. We had a group of Bonars that lived in our back alley. We had a bunch of Pukas that would hang out in the nightclub itself. We mostly stayed away from vampires because those guys are always a pain in the butt. But like literally, there was one of them though that reminded me of that. We were going to play Legend of the Five Rings, which is a delightfully fun game, and it's much more that kind of more classic like samurai movie feel to it. There's all of, there's honor, is the whole thing. One of your skills is Iaijitsu, the art of drawing your sword. There's like tea ceremony is another one of your skills, I think. It's this very fun, very rich, very interesting game. And we did that. We had two characters, both had the love attribute, which is a detriment. Being in love in that sort of scenario means that you're going to have your heart broken and things will be bad. So we got extra build points for creating our characters because we were in love. But then we created this web, and we literally had to draw this like web of how our characters knew each other, and this person hated that person, but they were secretly in love with this person. It was this whole fun thing, and so it was a lot of fun to just sort of build this very interesting sort of scenario before it actually got off the ground. And I don't know how many times we'd do so. Like I had one session where we were playing Mage, we were getting started, and I was like, I want to play this sort of like hard-boiled noir detective, but I want to start with a different character and then have that character get killed and then introduce this new one, because I thought it'd be just a fun sort of gimmick to do with the DM. So I talked with the DM, and I had to tell you, it's really hard sometimes to kill a character. Like, he literally at the end ended up getting hit by a bus, just because we were like, this character won't die, because everyone else is fighting so hard to keep him alive. And I was just like, just let him die, just let him go. And then eventually, I got hit by a bus. And then my character stepped out from the bus and was like, "Come with me," which was a lot of fun. But yeah, nice. Session Zero is such a fun, magical time, I think, for that kind of character creation and figuring out like how do these characters know each other beforehand.
Yeah, another one it's kind of in the house rule / alternative ways of running a game was a couple of times I've run with a co-DM that was not an announced co-DM. So they're actually playing an NPC that's infiltrating the group. And sometimes that'll go. Like I've also had player characters have a motivation that's completely not related to the other players, and they're working against everything that the players were trying to do. That was that was my 10-year campaign, and that one actually went on for 8 years, where he was able to play stupid that long. I don't know how. It was hard as a DM to keep up the ruse.
Yeah.
But in the case of like running as a co-DM, we would actually script like okay, he had a character, but he would help determine the story, and he was manipulating the players the whole time.
Yeah,
and it's a hard one. Or in one of the cases, it was a World of Darkness thing, and it was a disease affecting an island that his character had created, but was pretending to be one of the victims.
Yeah,
trying to help them, but was it was the classic action movie / twist of no, it was the guy with you the whole time.
Yep.
So
those are a lot of fun. And actually, so the co-DM thing is something that I've always wanted to try. Firstly, because I saw, I don't know if you've seen Dragon Friends. They're an Australian improv group that does D&D. And it's the most magical setup ever, because they have the one DM that takes care of like mechanics and the story in general. There's the second DM that generally does the voices for all the characters, all the NPCs. And they work basically in tandem. There's then obviously the between 3 to 4 players, and then they have a guy on a keyboard doing a live soundtrack as the game goes, and that is not to be underestimated. Like the amount you can change the tone with the music, it's so much fun. Plus they're hilarious because they're all improv actors, so like they don't understand the mechanics in the slightest, but they're just like, we're gonna go, we're gonna, it's the yes and for D&D, which is magical. The other reason that I want to try it is I want to do a Shadowrun heist. Because in the heists, usually you've got your field team that's actually infiltrating the place, and then you've got your deckers and your people in the Matrix doing their thing. And I would love to have those two teams separate. And they'd have a voice chat so they could talk to each other, but in the case that the hacker fails, I turn that voice chat off, and now they can't communicate with each other, and you've got these two sort of disparate things trying to interact with each other. I think that would be loads of fun, but logistically sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, you would have to have it really planned out. Yeah, that would
like every room and every DC and everything all planned out, which I don't. For any of you who have ever played with me before, you know that I know essentially nothing when I go into a session. I fly by the seat of my pants, and I got to tell you, we've gone places, and it's gone titanically wrong.
Yeah. So I another thing in my background that I did is I did a lot of live action World of Darkness. So
Oh,
back in
okay,
the
like
day,
the Vampire the Masquerade.
yes. So
Yeah.
we would do that, but these sessions were incredible. This was in Santa Cruz, California, and we would have 75 people playing. So you would have a storyteller who would come up with the story, and you would have a narrator. What they call? Oh my gosh, it's been a long time. But basically, they would have sub storytellers
Yeah.
who would be NPCs and stuff. But they would have to know when things are going to happen, like at 3:30 or whatever, like, at 11 o'clock. This is going to happen. You need to go. You need to make sure you get the other players. It was a nightmare, and we had to have like meetings like over coffee every night. So to be like, what happened? Oh my god! And that was before we had smartphones and
Wow, yeah.
yeah. So it was an intense undertaking, and we had spin-off groups. We had like one in Monterey, one in like So and we would like have people who would play in different places. So like it was early kind of adventure league in a way, but directly communicating, because you would have to work their story into the it was fun, but it was a job.
There's a thing, I haven't got a chance to participate in one, but there's a YouTube channel called Shut Up and Sit Down, which if you haven't watched it and you like board games, would 100% recommend it. They have amazing reviews of board games. But in one of these reviews, they're talking about, I'm going to get the name wrong. I think it's called like a mega game. Essentially, it's a board game and a LARP, the live action role play, that have been sort of like merged together, which is great. So in this particular scenario that they talked about, they were all the world leaders of different countries, and there's aliens coming down, and so every sort of turn, they would like decide where troops are being moved, and so whoever was the head of the military would decide that, and then you had the research division, and there was all this sort of stuff. And it seemed like a really very interesting sort of thing to get to participate in. We wandered off the things, but at the same time, I like discussing nerd stuff with you guys. I think it's fun.
Right? Yeah, it's always fun.
I actually discovered you were talking about the live action role play. I didn't realize so I've done Bellegarth for a long time, and I always thought that it was pretty LARP adjacent. But then I actually heard about like what happens during like one of the combat LARPs, where like you have a certain amount of hit points and you're yelling the hit points as you're swinging your foam padded swords, and then you have to like do mental math or something. Like basically by comparison, Bellegarth is stick jocks all the way. You hit the chest, you're dead. You lay down. You get hit in the arm. You put your arm behind your back. 2 limbs, you're dead. Everyone's done, stand back up, and then after the fighting's done, you just go hang out in your sort of normal tent and just hang out with your nerdy friends.
So. Yeah, I never did the fantasy. The thing that was interesting about doing the World of Darkness thing was we would do it in public spaces, and the point was, so you were all vampires, so you had to not show everyone around you were playing. So it became this weird metagame of like how big can we get, and like not be apparent that we are doing something strange. It was all done with rock, paper, scissors, so you had to try and do that secretly. But if any challenge, but challenges didn't come up very often.
Yeah.
But like, it's not a combat game, so you're much more social and trying to like. Yeah. So you try and put a murder mystery out on the table, or that was usually every once in a while we had a few people that ran that would try and turn it into like a D&D type thing. It's like, it doesn't work. Exactly. He turns into a 9-foot tall monster. It's like, we can't do anything we can't see. So why did you do that? Yeah. That would be the kind of, because we had multiple storytellers, so in different areas.
You brought up an interesting point. I feel like D&D, sort of having been its progenitor being a tabletop combat game, lends itself to much more sort of combat stuff, whereas something like a White Wolf is much more sort of social based. Mm-hmm. So for you guys, do you have any sort of specific rules that you use for like sort of social interactions as far as house rules that you've come up with so far?
I haven't. And one of the games I've taken a lot of inspiration from isn't White Wolf. I played a game called Torg. And in that one, I always love one mechanic, which is they have like a deck of cards, and every time initiative is done by a deck of cards, and it'll have a suggested action. You get a bonus if you do the action on it. And they broke combat down into attacking, defense, and then a bunch of other things like pulling a trick, which is something like blowing dirt in somebody's eyes, or pulling the rug out from under them, or intimidation is something you can use to throw them off balance. You can threaten them with a hidden weapon, or you can attack me, but you're gonna fight my friend. And there's no friend, but that kind of thing. But like having actual social things having implications on combat was something I always liked. It doesn't work terribly well. You can use the help action, but you don't get to influence it. You just do a help action. You describe it, but you don't get to use your cool persuasion to add to that help. That would be really cool. I've thought about messing with it, but once again, I just haven't. But yeah, that would be sweet. That would be the thing that I would like to have in like an optional rule setting for D&D would be some form of not social combat, but alternative actions. Like I said, using intimidation in combat is something that a lot of people want to do.
And that's actually one of the things that I run into, and why I would love to ask you guys about how you would deal with this. Intimidating combat is probably the second most done thing, with the exception of attacking people, that I experience but obviously spells fall into that attacking category. But intimidating in combat is so common, and I always run into that problem where I'm not really sure, like, how can I mechanically represent that? Like, more often than not, it's obviously that the enemies will run away. That's an easy one. But there's a lot of situations where that doesn't really necessarily make sense. And it also doesn't make sense that they would just do it immediately. But like some of that slowly chipping away at their sort of their resolve is the thing that makes sense. So almost like a social hit points. Because that's the thing. Like when you attack, you don't one-shot people with attacks for the most part. But having a mechanic, like you're slowly being whittled down and you know how many hit points you have, and you can kind of see how many hit points your enemy has. Which remind me to talk about bloodied enemies. But having some sort of mechanic where you can sort of see that incremental loss, so you can then eventually be like, well, and then they run away, or they end up joining your side. How do you guys deal with intimidation in combat?
So I also have to get going pretty soon, but for intimidation during combat, sometimes I know the rules say it's like a bonus action to do any sort of like other check.
I think using skills is actually a full action.
Yeah,
or that too. But like sometimes if it's like the mighty dragonborn barbarian wants to scream and yell, I'll say roll an intimidation check as a free action. And then if they roll, typically he's been rolling really well whenever he does it. And I'm just like, you bellow like a dragon and you strike fear into your enemies. And then it just makes it that much more fun for like the imagination. It doesn't really affect the characters that much, except like the NPCs might soil their pants.
Yeah.
Another good one with an intimidation check, though, is to have social implications later. If they don't kill everything they're fighting, of course, you can have their reputation become more of like, oh, it's that guy. Like the intimidator, it's that person becomes socially something more. Same with somebody who's very persuasive. They're like, hey, I hear you put on good parties, or, oh, I heard you're a lot of fun, or I'll let you into the back area of the club. Or I have special deals for heroes, that just any of that stuff, that little bit, in that sense of kind of like building up a reputation would be good, whether for good or ill, or you might be noticed by the Thieves Guild because you've been taking out all the muggers.
So you mentioned, Alex, the intimidate checks. A lot of times I'll get that where someone will they'll get a particularly good hit. They're like, I really did a lot of damage, and like it's either yelling at the rest of the group, or like they'll turn to the rest of them and be like, you're next, and that can and a lot of times I'm like, we'll roll an intimidate. Just as a sort of a free thing, because I like to have it have that implication and actually do something, which is always fun when they're like they kill someone, they turn to them and they're like, you're next, but they roll rubbish, so it's like I'm gonna get you, I guess. I'm gonna get you.
Or they just turn around and have like some massive voice crack. You're next.
Yeah.
A lot of times those characters use charisma as a dump stat too, so they're like, oh, I rolled a 3, and it's actually a 1 for my character.
Yeah, I do always love that when they don't bother to get intimidate. Although I found that a lot of times intimidate is a skill that's pretty easy to get proficiency on, with a handful of the different backgrounds, and then obviously fighter has it as one of their skills they can grab.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's always been something I've kind of struggled with as of late, is just trying to come up with a more sort of dynamic sort of resolve system. You, I think, mentioned before, you had, Jason, in your sort of large scale combat, after like a certain amount of enemies were injured in your sort of, because you would make group of
group
orcs
hit
into a
points,
single unit. And then
I made it a charisma check is what I did. It was a charisma saving throw, and it was like at disadvantage if they managed to kill the one I designated leader.
Yeah.
So I would let the players say who they were attacking, and I would make one the secret leader,
Yeah.
or obvious, or they could try and make rolls to figure out who the leader was.
Yeah, good use for that insight skill.
Yeah. Yep. The kids, only a couple of the groups really tried to do that, or they would notice if I said something like he barks an order at that guy, and oh, he's gone. Which was a good reason. Like I pointed that out when they started giving orders to each other, that they started getting targeted. That one scared them. All of a sudden, why are all the arrows coming at me? You're giving out orders to everybody. You're the leader.
Well, it's also that fun dynamic of like when their intention of being scary is to keep themselves from being attacked, but then because they're big and scary, they're the one that everyone else wants to attack. It's very interesting, kind of that sort of thing. So, it sounds like we're getting ready to wrap up. The one final thing I want to bring up, because it's one of the things that I kind of stole from fourth edition. There was apparently a bloodied mechanic in fourth.
Yes. Oh no, there definitely was.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it functioned, but essentially, when players are dealing with NPCs, I don't tell them how many hit points they have or how much like where they're at. But at such a point as they hit half of their hit points, then I tell them they've been bloodied, that can be really interesting, because like they'll do like a big grievous attack and massive damage, and they're like, oh, he's got to be really injured. And I was like, he's not bloodied yet, and they're like, but I did 30 points of damage. I'm like, he's got more than 30 hit points, or more than 60 anyway.
If you, just as a throw out there, on D&D Beyond, if you do the tracker, the initiative thing, it actually
goes orange when they get bloodied. Yep.
It's weird that they do it, because it's not a mechanism in 5th edition, unless they're going to be putting it in.
I remember Chris Perkins even actually mentioned, like, when dealing with combat, someone did like to first blood in a tournament, which that's always kind of a weird thing too, because hit points are an abstraction of how much pain you're in, your parry, how back foot you are. But he mentioned specifically that when you hit half hit points, that's kind of generally the line where you've taken your first blood and you're now starting to actually bleed. And Alex, when you need to take off, feel free to take off.
Okie doke.
I think we're getting close, but I always like to kind of, whatever inspires the noodle, talk about it.
Right. Exactly. Well, I got to do a couple of things before I start up my next session. So I will. I'll go ahead and clock out. So yeah.
All right.
Sounds good.
It's always fun talking.
Yep. On Monday, we're going to be, next Monday, we're talking improv. I've got this amazing book, which if you look this guy up, I love it so much. If she wants to sponsor episodes, do it. It has 100 different ideas for quests. So we're going to roll, we're going to get some quests, we're going to talk through how we would run a session with that, and the job of the other two players is to throw monkey wrenches into our plans as we're going through it. So we'll sort of show how you can adapt to stories as they're changing, as they're coming at you fast. Because one of the things that I think a lot of times DMs are told is, just learn to improv, and it's like, where do you start with that? So we're going to show you how to improv. As odd as that sort of sounds. So, anyway, fun. Exactly. We'll talk to you later.
I'll see you guys later.
See you on Monday. So Jason, do you have any? I think
I think that covers most of my. I have a lot of house rules that I don't really think about, but I do use.
Right.
Like I'm very big on, like you say, you mentioned the thing with like. For a specific thing, I'll do specific rules. Like that thing with the large armies, I was like, I didn't want to have to keep track of all those individuals. So I did that mob rule thing, and like the whole charisma check thing was just there were goblins, orcs, and gnolls. It was they had low charismas. I kind of wanted to fail those rolls when they came up. But and then plus adding a little bit of that other gamification of having the leaders, that just it seemed like fun.
Well, and that's what's always very fascinating is like with the game that has sort of mechanics for a lot of different things, and I feel like that's much more so in previous editions. I think fifth edition has more sort of embraced that sort of storytelling aspect. Magic Combat being a great example of the rules for Magic Combat is sometimes you can ride a horse when you fight. Which double-edged sword. On the one hand, they've made it so you can focus more on the things you care about, but at the same time, also, as a DM, if it's especially if it's something you haven't really thought about before, where they're like, I want to do this weird thing, and you're like, well, what does it say in the book? And you open up the book, and it's like, I don't know. Sometimes you ride a horse. You're like, How does that help me?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You're talking about like those alternate rules in the DMG because there's a lot of them. Of I was going through it earlier because my son is playing a Drunken Master, and he wanted to know, well, what can I do to keep in, how does this work? And so I was kind of explaining, going through those alternate attack things like disarming. One of them. It's a great thing, but it's perfect for a Drunken Master. But like explaining exactly what grappling is, like we were both talking about how we both make that mistake.
Yep.
And he's like, well, how do I entangle then? And I didn't realize there isn't a rule in base D&D of actively, like, unless you take the grappler feat.
I was going to say, the grappler feat is basically the only one.
Yeah, it's the only way. And I was like kind of fascinated by that because like, wait, I'm a fighter. Like, shouldn't I?
Yeah. The basic just getting people into chokeholds should be a thing that basically everyone kind of knows how to do. You would assume. But at the same time, also I can kind of see, because like when you have, I think the Battle Master is the one that has a lot of those like tripping and disarming and that sort of thing. And basically by being that class, you've unlocked all those abilities. And so on the one hand, I can kind of see how, like, the Battle Master is the one that does the disarming and the tripping and stuff. But it doesn't, to me, make a lot of sense that someone couldn't just, whack someone on the hand to try and knock their sword out. But then again, you run into the situation where you're like, but a hero would know to keep their hands protected and can keep a hold of their sword because they're a hero.
Yeah. Although I was comparing the two, the disarm for Battle Master and the disarm that's in the DM's guide, it's the disarm for a Battle Master is a ton better. So you're going to be
and then having the D8 that you can add to all your stuff is always...
And you'll do damage when you do it. Whereas if you do it without, you don't do any damage.
Yeah.
And it only falls to their feet. So...
Well, and then also, I think, because both of us are coming from older editions, like in 3rd and 3.5 and Pathfinder, grappling is huge. Like, grappling is massive. Like, if you get grappled and you can't attack anymore, you definitely can't cast spell, or you can attack, but like with small weapons... but at the same time, it was also one of those ones where, sure, anyone could do it, but if you didn't have the right feats for it, you're not going to be able to, like, do it well. There's the whole unarmed attack thing. And so I guess in many ways, like, in the same way that in 5th edition, you do need that feat to really pin people. In 3.5, you did need that, like, extra feat to not, suck at grappling people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I feel like the feat economy in 3rd, 3.5, and Pathfinder is like you get one every other level. Whereas in 5th edition, you have to decide, are you going to feat or are you going to up your stats? And that's only every 4 levels, and that's massive. And that's only every 4 levels in a single class.
Yeah.
Which is huge as far as decision making goes. So yeah, it is very interesting, and I think the two of us in particular come from an odd sort of perspective in that we're thinking of the old edition. Flanking, great example of like it was different in previous editions, and this edition has changed because of it, or has changed, and because of that, it's kind of weird trying to reconcile those kind of differences.
Yeah, the thing about grappling, because I was trying to look through the lens of a Drunken Master, and we watched like a couple of fight scenes from a Jackie Chan Drunken Master movie. And so we were actually looking at it and going like, oh, when he grabs a hold of that guy's shirt and spins him around, it's like, and dragging him with him to a certain area, that's a grapple. Because he can't move and you're pulling with him, and the guy could still hit him back. It's hard to hit, a monk, but that's what grappling is. It's not the wrestling grappling, which is weird because they use the term grapple, and I always think of a grappler as a wrestler.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I guess that's also the thing, is that kind of perspective shift of like when you the thing I've sort of started discovering more is that reducing someone's speed to 0 can be pretty huge, especially when you're in situations where like they're like very low on hit points, they need to get away, and then I don't know if I think this is technically rules as written, but Grappling is a special type of attack, and an opportunity attack is an attack that you get to make. So you can, when someone leaves your threat range and you get that opportunity attack, instead of whacking them, you can try to grapple them, which is massive because now instead of them running away, you've now stopped them.
That could be mean with like a swarm of small enemies.
Yeah.
Except for you could disengage. Yeah, disengage is another one of those things where it's like I'm always tempted because like every once in a while somebody will disengage and they run through your entirely meticulously planned little like I put all these enemies in your way and it's like it doesn't matter, you just ran through them.
Yeah, but at the same time, like that's still them using their action, and if it's something that has that as a bonus action, it feels really good to be like I have outwitted the DM by using this ability. So I think that can be kind of fun, but also very frustrating because you're like, why would you do that? My plan.
You have to think about that in your combats. Like, they can just, when you're setting up the encounter, you have to be like, all right, well, there's a good chance that they will just, because man, I've had a couple of encounters where it's like, I don't remember what it was. It was like a Balthanor or something weird like that, where its whole thing is its tentacles and it grabs a hold of you and they would just, disengage and back away out of its range. And it was like, and then, it would have to slowly move after them.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, then is when that grappling would be so very, very effective. But yeah, if they're disengaging and moving away, then yeah, that can be kind of a thing. So one of the things I thought was I had that was really fun. I had in a 5-foot tunnel, there was a bunch of kobolds that was attacking a bunch of players, and for a while they would just fight them one-on-one and kill them, and then that became less of a sort of a challenge. And I realized that kobolds wouldn't just wait in line like that. The first one runs up and attacks, and then gets this big-eyed look as he gets yanked back by the next kobold. And sure, he's going to not get an opportunity attack on his face and probably die because he's a kobold. But then the next one pops up and whacks, but then he gets yanked back by his buddy, and then the next one attacks. But you only have that one opportunity attack, or that one reaction, which can be kind of brutal because there were like 5 or 6 of these kobolds. And sure, the first one took a boop to the snoot, but then they're just rotating through who gets to attack next, which was very, very interesting as far as like running a tunnel fight.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I always like kobolds just for doing they're a good excuse for traps.
Yeah.
So.
I know that I don't do enough traps. I as a DM, that is one of my sort of weak points is traps, especially because like a lot of times when I think of it, it's just good old fashioned pressure plate and then like a pit trap. You got the arrows shooting from the side, maybe a pendulum at a door. But there can be such interesting, fascinating traps. In Xanathar's Guide, they have this like really interesting, complicated, like spinny, choppy thing with a bunch of slammy posts, and it's very interesting, sort of mechanically. Because it's multiple turns of them having to do things. I think a trap where it's just like, you make a roll and then the trap is done. Like that's a hiccup that I think, unless I'm trying to whittle down their hit points to make it so the next fight's going to be more challenging, which then you run into the problem of they'll just take a short rest if they've taken too much damage. I feel like there's sort of unnecessary hiccups, and unless they're interesting traps.
Yeah, I prefer like traps, especially if they're not necessarily deadly traps, and there's something that they can see coming. That they kind of slap their heads, going, "Oh, why didn't we notice that?" Are the best ones. Like in the season 1 thing that we do. Typically, it's I have a warren of kobolds that have infested the walls, and they see it as their home, but they don't trust the main rooms, so they've just made it into a giant like murder hallway. It's Saw, but with kobolds looking through the holes. If they're paying attention, they will see kobolds like kind of dart by mouse hole that they think is a mouse hole, but they'll pour flasks of oil out onto the floor when they get locked and lock the room and then light it on fire. They can do a lot of things if they figure it out, and because they can just stop that hole. They can bust down the door, but it's fun to especially because there's a direct. They can try and talk to them. We've had that happen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's a trap you can talk to. Some were dropping rocks on ropes just down at head level, bam! And the whole floor was slicked with oil. Yeah,
like pulling them back up.
Pull them back up and let them go again. And there was a bunch of spikes in the center of the room. If they weren't paying attention, they hit them in the head and throw them into spikes. So.
Oh man, that could be really interesting. Of like, instead of trying to attack them like with damage, basically swinging pendulum rocks at them to then try to do the shove action to have them fall into the hole in the middle.
Yeah,
that's interesting. I like that.
Yeah, plus like the other thing was I put slick water. It was slick. The rocks around the whole thing were slick, and so that was what they thought the challenge was not to slip. It's like doing acrobatics checks to walk out carefully, or scooting on their butts, and then all of a sudden the scooting on the butt was the best one because the ropes were at like human height. So dwarves, halflings, and gnomes were pretty much immune
to them. Yeah,
to this trap. Which is always you're very proud when you're a short race and it pays off.
Well, that was I had one that was actually very fascinating. So I was doing the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, and in one of the hallways, it's perfectly clean. It's this immaculate hallway, and like it describes a lot of the sort of the dirtiness and the grossness of it. And so one of the players, being a teenager, a young teenager, is like, well, I'm going to throw dirt on the floor. I think originally his idea was he wanted to see what was cleaning it and trying to get that cleaner to come out. But it happened to be that he was throwing dirt by virtue of throwing it out, he was throwing it in front of himself. So the gelatinous cube that was at the end of the hall, he saw before he walked into it, which ultimately meant that he didn't get enveloped by it, which meant like it was this whole thing. But it was such a fascinating kind of thing where he accidentally found the best way to deal with this challenge. I was like, you did it. That was awesome.
Good accidental save. Yeah.
I also discovered that invisibility, greater invisibility specifically, and fly makes someone undetectable because they're not touching the ground. They're not making noise. They're just gone. I had a group that was chasing an enemy, and again, that whole sort of placement and action economy was very important because there was fireballs involved, so he knew kind of basically how far he could move. And I think we talked about this the other day, but speaking of house rules and stuff, when you're invisible or when you're hiding, taking the model off the map.
Oh, yeah.
To make it so they can't just be like, well, I'm guessing he's probably where that model is. Fireball there.
Yeah, that's that's actually something I would like to house rule, but because I have a character that likes to use fireballs a lot, especially because like their current encounters in the woods, and I'm like, you're burning the forest down, like you are a monster.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, whatever. Yeah. But because you don't have to roll to hit with fireball, which I get, it's a save, but you don't have to roll to target a specific area. So he'll try and do that like where it's perfectly lined up, and I'm like, no, you have to guess. Like I'm not gonna. But he'll sit there and he's like, hold the camera here and like count the squares, and I'm like, oh. Yeah. And so it's like, all right, yeah, you can do that. I find it weirdly not in the spirit of a fireball. Like to me, fireball is just like, let's go crazy.
Yeah,
like
I have to make that risk of like there is that all my allies are engaged in melee combat. Yeah. These things that are wrapped around them, I'm gonna hit my friends if I shoot there, but that's the maximum efficiency. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is always kind of an interesting one too. Well, but it also comes to the other thing. Like I heard a story of a DM who had a player who was very new, and he cast his sleep spell, but he cast it so that he was in the radius, and he put himself to sleep. And I was like, on the one hand, like I was like, that almost is like meta DMing in a weird kind of way, because any caster who had learned the sleep spell would not put themselves to sleep because they understand how the sleep spell works. But just because the player doesn't understand it doesn't mean that they would be penalized in that. Like, because to me, it just felt like the DM being like, gotcha. And I was like, but like the amount of time and effort that it would take for a character to learn that spell, they would know, I can't be in it. I'm gonna get knocked out. So that was a weird kind of thing where it just like it never really set right with me. I mean, obviously DMs, it's their game. I wasn't even playing in it.
But I warned them. I said, you're going to be affected. But he took the chance and he knocked himself out. But he had two allies that were nearby that dragged him away and got the other one. So it was like it was a worthwhile thing. They were low-level kobolds or something. And it's like, but. Like, I would agree with you. They're like, no, I mean, you should get the warning. Unless your character is purposely absent-minded, like, Or if they argue, because there will be players that are like, I'm not going to be affected.
Yeah.
And it's like, then, it's free game. Yeah, another one is like, Fireball will do that. But I can see not knowing the first time you cast Fireball, you might not be aware of how big that radius is. And that's usually the case.
Yeah, that 20-foot radius is huge. Like, it's such a massive amount of space that you can take up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Laptop's dying, so I gotta plug it in real fast.
Oh, gotcha.
And it's funny too, because I'm in this spot, so I have to plug myself into like the ceiling above me, so it's very.
Oh, yeah, that's always spooky.
All right, I'm back.
Okay.
But yeah, and so it's that interesting sort of like spectrum of the thing. Well, on the one hand, it's like they're meticulously counting square by square by square to determine where they can like do maximum efficiency, whereas the other person's just like, I don't know, maybe I catch myself or something. So.
Yeah,
I've
in
seen
the
it both
adult
ways,
game,
to be
I have
sure.
a magic item that hurled a fireball, and the player who did it was playing a monk. I let it be a magic item he could use, and so he had no idea what he was doing when he let that thing loose. And it was like, we're surrounded by enemies. It affects a group, and I didn't tell him what it did. I said he could cast this spell, but he didn't. It was before we weren't using D&D Beyond, so he just had the word fireball, and he's like, but it made sense. His character wouldn't have known what he was doing, and so he got everybody, except for him because he was a monk and had a high dex save. But yeah,
And that evasion.
But yeah.
Actually, that's one of my. I've mentioned this before, but I have a fighter in a Pathfinder game, and I love intentionally not metagaming. Like, because he has no idea how magic works. Like, he's been around people who cast spells. He knows that spells exist. Like, he's not ignorant to magic, but he's just ignorant to how it works. So he'll be like, he just constantly is turning to the druid or the sorcerer and being like, oh, you have a spell for that, right? Like, you could just use your magic for it. Like, anything. Like, find a badger, just anything. It's just like, oh, yeah, use your spell. He's like, that's not a spell that exists or that I have. And I'm like, why not? You're a magic user. Like, knowing perfectly well as a player that I'm like, yeah, well, obviously this spell isn't real. Although that one kind of helps because it's been a while since I've really dove into Pathfinder spells. So I'm mostly going off my D&D spell memory. So it could be fun to just be like, coming from that kind of wrong perspective.
Yeah, no, totally.
Fun.
All right, well, I should probably get going too.
This is probably a good stopping point. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Jason, for discussing this. I think if we do well, and I should have mentioned this to Alex, but I think if people enjoy our improv class, I would love to get my sister and Ryan, the two people that did the first episode with me. The audio was destroyed on. I think we recorded it twice. So it's like, and the audio is just a tiny fraction off. So it's difficult to listen to. But I would love to have them on as well. So we might try to get some guest stuff later.
Yeah, it might be interesting to do a session 0. Like,
that would be amazing. We should absolutely do a session 0 as well. I think we actually the week after next. So in my first time I was doing some stuff, I did do like a whole like character creation like session 0, which was very, very fun and fascinating. But I would love to do that with you guys and with a little bit more audience, because I think then I had like 2 or 3 people. But yeah, I think a session 0 would be awesome because we've been talking about it a lot. But I think really diving into what that looks like. And I think we should even like just make characters, like get those built. Maybe even talk about some of the numbers and how we would change them depending on the stuff. So, but yeah, next week we're doing improv class. We're going to go through what it's like to run an adventure and kind of crack open the old noodle and sort of see what's going along behind the scenes, because there's a lot of times that the DM will just sort of stare at the players for a moment and then say something and you have no idea how they got from point A to point B. So we're going to lift up the veil, so to speak, on that.
Because I was training Alex how to run a game, and most of the time, like he was my cameraman, but I couldn't be saying what I was thinking to get to the process in the moment. I'd have to be like, I need to make a mental note now to tell Alex
why you did what you did,
why I did that, because like I would do different things. Like one of the groups, they decided to harass one of the people that would be an important NPC, and that was how they got to the next point. And I had to totally change the encounter on the fly.
Yeah.
And it was they went through a totally different thing, and it was interesting, but I had to explain. He was confused because all of a sudden I'm going off the script. I did it a few times, and I'm like, you have to look at where it's gonna go, and you're balancing so many things as a DM. So
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that. Also, one of the things I thought would be fun, and this is I don't know how exactly we'll do it, but I've always liked the idea of us just playing a game, but then taking the session, taking the things, and doing like kind of a commentary on it, where we kind of do that sort of deep dive breakdown on it, but like posthumously, so to speak.
Yeah.
That'd be kind of interesting because I think we're actually pretty good at not taking player knowledge, but I think that'd be a kind of a fascinating way of doing it, of just like having a session get played through so you can kind of see what it looks like, and then like taking that full session and sort of breaking down the bits and pieces, like even something as simple as how did you come up with the difficulty class for X, whatever, because that's the thing that I think a lot of new DMs struggle with is like how do I determine DCs for things on the fly. Obviously, you can prepare, and there's a lot of good resources, but sometimes curveballs are thrown, and you have to just be like, I don't know, 13. But yeah, so anyway, it was lovely chatting with you, Jason. As always, it was lovely chatting with you, people of the internet. We will see you again on Monday at 1. But until then, stay safe out there, and bye.
Bye.
I have to figure out how to end this correctly. Oh.